Welcome to Sex Ed with DB. I'm your host, DB, aka Danielle Bezalel. Let's get into it. Welcome to our first bonus episode of the podcast. In Vote for Pleasure Part 2, my best friend Safeena and I talk about why she loves politics so much, the importance of voting and why swing states matter, and finally, we dissect a CNBC article titled Abortion, Equal Pay, Family Leave. Here are all the women's rights policies proposed by 2020 candidates so far. For every question, we refilled our glasses with delicious and very cheap wine, so that's fun. She's beauty and she's grace, a top-notch NYU law student, and my bestie, Safeena Mecklai.
I really was like, after we talked, I was like, how are we going to do this? And then you were like, here's the plan. And I was like,
okay,
that's the right plan.
Okay. We are half a drink in.
Barely.
Just barely. We kind of did the thing where you like pour a glass, drink a couple sips.
Right. Oh my God.
That
looks great.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's
thanks.
awesome.
Yeah. That's the bust feature.
Yeah, with
that I
Aquafina.
got custom framed.
You know that movie has 99% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Okay, what were you even gonna say?
Don't remember.
Cool. Welcome, Safeena the Weena.
Thank you, Danielle the Swell.
Okay, the first thing that came to my mind when I wanted you to be on this episode was, remember when you were like running in student government at Berkeley, and I would be like, a vote for Safeena Mecklai is like a vote for Marty McFly.
I, of course, remember that.
Why did I do that?
First of all, that was the catchiest tagline you could have ever come up with.
You've ever had in your life?
Why did you do that? Berkeley student government is a strange little town.
Yes.
It's extremely competitive, and because it's Berkeley, everything feels way more political and like life or death in a way that like other people who did student government were like, I planned a huge party every year, and I'm like, I never thought about parties one time.
You don't
I thought
get
about the student body. So I think that some weird features of Berkeley student government are, one, when I ran in the last election that I ran in, there were 12,000 people that voted.
Fuck.
Which is like madness.
That's so many people.
Yeah. So people get really engaged and excited. And I think it's a place where people test out their politics, specifically when they're on the left. I think there's like a small and loud Republican contingent at Berkeley, but the two dominant political parties at Berkeley are like left and like way left.
Yeah,
and I think that reflects our Democratic primary that we're seeing right now. It reflects how I think a lot of people who are quote unquote liberal or Democrats perceive their own politics. It's like a battle for like where on the left spectrum we want to be.
Yeah.
And you were just a really good friend because you held up the sign.
I just really loved handing out those
Little
signs, flyers to people and
with
making
my face
calls.
on them.
Yeah.
And my big
so proud.
cheeks.
Your chubby cheeks.
My chubby cheeks.
Safeena, you're my best friend, and I'm really happy that you're on the podcast.
It's an honor, Danielle.
You know, Scout's honor, as they say.
It's an honor, Danielle.
Okay, let's start by like understanding who you are and like a little bit about like your background, kind of like why you care. But you're like my most politically smart and engaged. You're my most like blank friend for like most things I have, like smartest, funniest, most beautiful, amazing.
Thank you, Danielle.
And also you're very politically engaged. So I kind of want to just hear like a little tidbit about your background and your story, and like why do you care so much about politics?
It's a beautiful question, and I think in 2019, most of my friends feel like they have no choice but to care about politics because post-Trump, it sort of feels like we're all in like DEFCON, whatever, DEFCON
5 is what they say.
Oh, cool, yeah.
DEFCON 5.
DEFCON 5. Mike, you heard that, military talk. But I think what got me interested in politics is I'm an immigrant to this country from Canada. A terrifying place.
Tricked you, bitch.
Yeah, you got it. And I actually moved to the United States 6 months before 9/11. And my family is Muslim, And my parents got divorced, and we were like, California is the best place you can be in the whole world. And we moved to the US, and 6 months later, 9/11 happened, and on that day, my sister got beat up at school. Like, some kid knew that we were Muslim somehow, or I think a lot of kids who weren't Muslim but were Indian or South Asian and got, like, attacked or called out, you know. And we were in California, like, a pretty liberal town. We were far away from it all. And I think at that moment, that's, like, sort of my origin story of being interested in politics, because I was like, what the heck just happened?
Yeah.
And America and the US had seemed like this perfect, idyllic place. And we moved to a cul-de-sac. And, like, my mom was a single mom and could totally make it here. But it was like, oh, shoot, if we don't talk about who we are and why we matter, like, we're not going to be able to have a place here, and we'll go back.
Right.
I was 9 when that happened, so, like, I wasn't like, I will now be running for office. Hello, Sacramento.
No, but it was like the beginning of something for you.
Yeah. And I think people perceive politics to just be, like, voting or running for office or debating, but what's really important to me about politics is it's about being part of a community. And, like, anyone who has tried to be a part of a group or build a group and then help that group get what they need is, like, doing politics. So I think that my brand of politics has always been, there's activism, but you can't really be an activist or a politician unless you really understand the people that you're fighting for. And I think, like, the worst kind of politicians do it because they're kind of like, I'll run for office literally no matter where I am because I am the best person to represent anybody. And it's like, for what purpose? And, like, most of those people are, like, men who are generally white, who have a ton of money and are like, I got you guys.
Right.
And it's like, who even?
You probably don't,
are
though.
you?
Yeah.
So I think that politics looks a little bit like being open to building a community. And then from there, like, deciding how you can best serve that community.
God, you are, like, just Leslie Knope up the wazoo.
Thank you so much, Danielle.
No, you know, it's a real compliment.
Thanks.
Like, yeah. Okay, where are you now? Tell the people, like, who you are, like, what your kind of, like, goals are after skill and where you want to be.
So I just finished my first year of law school, which I kind of thought I might always want to do, but, like, feel now totally 100% sure that it was the right call. And I worked at a firm this summer, big law firm, which I think is what I want to do for a few years. It's, like, interesting work. I got to do a lot of pro bono work, some reproductive rights work with the firm, which was cool. And then my long-term goals are to, like, go back into government and figure out a way to make this city work a little better.
Amazing. Transitioning now to our next topic. So go ahead.
Very, very smooth.
Go fuck yourself. All right. Let's see. Yeah, we're going to take, every time we switch topics, we're going to, like, take a couple drinks.
Oh, okay,
so,
great.
At home, if you're listening and you, like, have had a long day, you're, like, pouring the wine, like, drink with us.
Yeah.
If you want.
Slurp up, which is what we just did right now.
Oh, God. Lord help me. Okay. So I want to really talk about, like, voting and engagement because I am someone who always has thought, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Basically, I feel like I'm someone who always thinks that voting is very important. Like, it really can, like, after reading Michelle Obama's book, especially, like, she is very empowering, and that she talks about, like, how Barack and her have been very transparent about the fact that voting in numbers, like, can change everything. And that, to me, is, like, really powerful. And yet people don't do it. Of course, there are so many different reasons. Like, there are barriers that people face. Obviously, like, more poor communities and people of color aren't able to get to the booths, or the booths close early, or whatever the horrible barriers that make it unjust, which of course need to be said. But also something that I think about is the fact that the Electoral College exists, and there are, like, 10 states solely that run the fucking election. And I think that being someone who's from New York and then moves to California and is back in New York, you know, the coasts have always basically been blue, and they basically will always be blue. and it's not about us. And it's funny because we're engaging with our friends about these things and they matter, but our vote doesn't matter as much. Can you just talk about that and like maybe explain a little bit about like the Electoral College and what you think about that?
Yeah, voting is so interesting because I think for some people who do vote, that is like their exercise of political autonomy, and it is like the Instagram post is sufficient to show that they are engaged. And you are totally right that like the way that our system was designed was to empower states, even those who are less populous and maybe shouldn't have as much power as they do.
Right.
And as a result, politicians focus on issues that for us, sometimes we're like, what are you even talking about? Like, why does this matter? You never come to our state. The debates are like the last one was in Detroit. It's like places that, matter, of course. But also then the issues get tailored to be those that resonate with that community. So the system is flawed. And I think like step one is always like, how are we going to fix that? And I think that there are people who are bringing lawsuits and who are really concerned with like the systemic change. I think for us who live on the coasts, who are politically engaged, who want to do something, like voting should be like 100% your bare minimum activity because it matters. Right. But like in a national election, like the chances your vote will make a huge difference are, you're right, slim to none. Right. That being said, in like local elections in New York, like the Queen's DA race, like 4 to 5 votes might make the difference.
Talk about that. What is that?
Yeah. So the DA, who is the district attorney in the boroughs, are elected. And in Queens, there was a race between sort of who you might consider a more establishment candidate and then a woman who is a former public defender who's running to be the DA. And this is like a huge movement in criminal justice reform, is to get sort of progressive people who did criminal defense work on the prosecution side, because they're like, I've lived what this does in these communities. Right. And I'm going to like come up with policies that are going to have, instead of saying like, yeah, it really sucks that marginalized communities are the highest hit by tough on crime laws. They're going to adjust how they prosecute cases. One thing that was like totally shocking to me in my first year of law school was learning that prosecutors have like almost absolute discretion to bring a case. So say like you and I are both committing the same crime.
Sure, as we would.
We're hooligans. And the prosecutor chooses to charge you, but not me. Their decision is basically like unreviewable. And it could be for any number of factors. Like they don't have to explain themselves. And they could choose to charge you or drop the charges against me or not even look at me. There's a ton of discretion when it comes to prosecutors.
That's fucked up.
It's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane. And part of it is like a separation of powers issue. In some ways, they're dealing with like a resource allocation issue. So we kind of defer to them on like what they want to spend their resources on. But, what that looks like is people's biases, what matters to them, they bring into the work with them. So all of this to say, in Queens, there was an election, part of this movement to get public defenders to run for office as DAs, and the vote went through a recount, and it's like extremely close. Like I think 5 to 10 votes could make a difference.
Wow.
Which is like back to Berkeley, like the kind of numbers that we dealt with at school.
Right.
And so locally, your vote super matters, and I don't want to take anything away from that. But on the national level, I think people are trying to think of creative ways to make their vote matter, because the system, the way that it is, and I think one way that people have been successful at expanding the power of their vote is, this happened a lot, like right when Trump was elected, there was like this movement where people were just blocking people on Facebook who they disagreed with. Right. Someone was like, oh, my uncle was all Trump today, so I blocked him. Happy Friday. And it's like, what? Yeah. And I think one of the most powerful methods of resistance is to sort of bring the people who are the most likely to be persuaded by you, your family, people who look like you, who live in these swing states, and to like engage them in conversation. Yeah. And I think that a lot of my friends who are like white women will ask me like, what can I do? And it's like, you know, I can't call your grandpa who like literally has never met a Muslim
Technically
before.
you can, but you will not, and you should not.
Yeah, and I could just butt dial your grandpa anytime I wanted to. But like the hard work that you can do when you have somebody in your orbit that might listen to you is to engage them in conversation.
Yeah.
Because that's like the power of your position as like a smart, progressive person who cares about this stuff is like, how can you be intentional with your own messaging? Because like when people watch the Democratic debates who aren't Democrats, like sometimes the way that they speak, the candidates speak, is like alienating to people who are outside the party. But if you're like, hey, grandpa, who now is a character in this.
Right.
And if you're like, this is why this matters to me. Here's the experiences from my life. You moved to this country for XYZ reason. I think that's a powerful way to like touch people who otherwise might not vote.
I think that's a great point. Do you know also of any like organizations or like ways to, so for example, like going to like Nevada to like canvas and like knock on doors is something that we did like in 2016 for the Hillary election. And then, you know, Nevada swung left and everyone was like, oh, we did it, you know? And like, obviously we didn't do that.
Actually, like you probably did do it.
Isn't that cool though?
It's
to
amazing.
Like go and like knock on doors, and it's horrible. Like who wants to be subjected to like someone like slamming the fucking door in your face being like, no, I'm voting for Trump and you can go fuck yourself. Not like everyone has that accent, but that's kind of what I think of when I think of someone saying that to me. And it's obviously not that accent. You know, I have family members in my own community. Obviously, everyone does who voted for Trump, or else he wouldn't have fucking been elected.
100%.
So I think it's interesting in terms of thinking about, number one, talk to people in your family and in your circle. Number two, should people be going to these swing states or donating money, or like what's the best way to go about it?
Yeah, I honestly, yes, and to everything.
Yeah.
I think like if you have a candidate, like connecting with their field team and just being like, I'm willing to spend a weekend where you can send me within driving training distance of where I am, is like, if you're going to donate $5 to like the party or to your candidate, if you would rather save your $5 and spend it on a train ticket to a swing district and spend some time out there, completely beautiful use of your money. And those field teams out there, they have people in like strategic parts of the country and will like happily activate you where you want to be. And I think this is one, something that you can do, anybody can do it, but the people who are most effective at it spend their time, their like train ride over, thinking about their story and like how, when you're face to face with another human being, you can connect about like why it matters that they should vote.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And then there's I think this popped up in 2016 and may have been like alive before then, but there are these sister district projects where a sort of like very blue district will kind of like adopt a sister district that's close by-ish and will basically leverage all of the energy of their members locally to do calls, phone banking, tweeting, messaging, and visits to this quote-unquote sister district.
Right.
And like, there's no need to do that formally. Like, you and your friends could sort of like pick a district,
right,
and decide like that's your place and that's where you're going to spend your time the election. But I think like an easy way out is to say like, I voted, I posted about this, and I'm like complaining to my friends about like the ambiguous people who aren't agreeing with me.
Right.
Because like, that's not going to do it.
It's so hard. It's so hard to feel like like your like influence is actually going to reach people, especially because with this like the past couple years and with this new election coming up, it's kind of like, oh no, like the people who voted for Trump are so different from me. You know, we have this thought in our head of like, well, if someone's going to vote for like a racist, sexist, misogynist, rapist, then like how could I ever connect with that person? And that to me is so hard to figure out, like how to convince people who in my head, like, chose to vote for someone either knowing or not caring about these, like, allegations, like, how do you even, like, connect?
Yeah, and I think the easy way to handle the situation is to dismiss, because it is painful. Like, as a woman, as a person of color, it's painful to know that there are people who would prioritize anything over, like, my safety and comfort and existence. But I think the only way that I've been able to, like, find any kind of love or common ground or, like, acceptance is the reason that people vote generally is, like, not hatred.
Yeah. It's for, like, their own shit.
Totally. It's, like, fear about their own financial well-being, or fear that because of people of color or women now succeeding and taking space in politics and in Congress, that, like, there are less seats for people that look like them. Or that as a result of progressive policies, like, they'll have to give up money that they feel like they don't have. And it's, like, so community-based. Like, I feel this way, going to Berkeley, there's, like, such a strong narrative about progressive politics that those who didn't buy into that felt completely alone and alienated. And some people, like, thrive by being isolated in that way. And it develops into, like, hatred and distrust and this, like, kind of climate of politics that we have now.
Yeah.
And I don't think the answer is to excuse the behavior, because it's, like, it's selfish and it's based in fear, which is, like, not the right way to make your decisions. But I think there's, like, a level of, like, there's a balance between, like, compassion and like, not wanting to preach or teach. Like, there was, like, a candidate in 2016 that was, like, convinced that, like, if only people understood that they were voting against their own interests, like, they would do better. And it's like, maybe that framing isn't the right framing. Maybe instead it's like truly and honestly, what are your motivators? And how can I show you that my candidate will get you those things better and, like, in a way that will continue to support your life and lifestyle?
Totally.
But it's like hard. I mean, it's hard because I would say most of my friends who, like, have not had a conversation with a person who openly and honestly voted for Trump.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, a lot of my, like, dad's side of the family, like, absolutely did. And a lot of that is kind of, like, Israel politics. And that, is really important to some people.
Totally.
And at the same time, back to, like, the original thing is, like, they're New Yorkers. Their Trump vote doesn't fucking matter. Like, if my family lived in Michigan or Ohio, like, their votes would have mattered way more. And I think it's just really interesting thinking about the idea of, like, yes, go out and vote. Yes, it's really important. And yes, swing states kind of matter more. And, like, that's just what it is.
Totally.
And, like, it sucks that, like, that's the reality. And a lot of people would rather, like, the popular vote be kind of the thing that people look to.
Totally.
And I'm just, like, what's the word?
Disheartened.
Disheartened, disingenuous, all of it.
You're dissed.
I'm just dissed. No, I don't know. It's just hard for me to understand how to even contribute. But I really love what you said in terms of, like, if people have, like, a free couple weekends in the, like, coming months, this is early, right? Like, the election isn't really, like, gearing up until, like, obviously the candidate is chosen for the Dems. And, like, once that happens, and I also think this, last point on this before we transition again, which is people who have this thought of, like, oh, well, if it's not X person, then I'm not voting. Or, like, I'm voting for an independent. Totally. And it's like, what these people have to understand, in my opinion, is that, like, we need to get Trump out of office. And, like, if the only way to do it, for example, if Biden is fucking the person and everyone hates Biden, like, don't not vote for Biden, because then we're going to have 4 more years of, like, horrible, racist, sexist Trump. And, like, your pride is not worth, like, 4 more years of, like, horribleness at all.
And I think what's important to remember is, like, in mass, those votes add up. And, like, we saw that independent candidates took a lot away from Hillary in 2016. And it's like, I think the the protest vote can be admirable and it can be useful when you've counted your votes. But otherwise, it's dangerous. And I think for those that really have something to lose, like, you know, their healthcare's on the line in 2020, or their livelihood, or their health and safety. And I mean, the earth, like, is on the line in 2020.
The earth is on the fucking line. It's on the fucking line.
And like, for those that don't know, I was a lobbyist before I went to law school. And like, so, you know, the way that I think about things is always like, what's our strategy? What's our end game? And like, what can we afford to give? And I think it's important as we think about what we care about to be sort of strategic. And I know that people hate that. Like, I know that it's a hard pill to swallow to think about like your values and then translating them into like a strategic approach to this game, because sadly it's like a game. Like, that's what we're talking about with swing states, with this comm strategy, with not blocking people on Facebook. It's like all a game, but it's the game we built, and you can, in like the off years of an election, challenge the game and like fix voting access and fix the electoral college. But when we're in the game, we got to play the frickin' game.
Wow, your metaphors are just off the charts.
I'm a huge game lover.
I'm a huge game lover.
I'm not.
No, you love that movie Game Night.
I do.
Don't lie.
And I love Jumanji.
Okay, let's be honest. The original Jumanji, top
Terrifying.
10 movies of all time.
And the new Jumanji.
Also not great,
No.
but I'll watch it because I love The Rock.
And I'll say this. I've never disagreed with you so strongly. One of the best movies ever made.
And I'll say this, you're wrong.
No, but
original Jumanji, I'll say this. Original Jumanji is way better than recent Jumanji.
And let me respond with this. No?
I can't. All right, let's talk about why we're even talking about these things. Because if you're listening, you may be thinking to yourself, hold on a hot sec.
Where's the sex?
Where's the sex? Sure. Where's the ed?
Sure.
You know? Really sure. Many times sure. And you're right in that we haven't talked about that yet. But the reason why I wanted to have Saffy Daffy Taffy on, that's her nickname. Don't mess with it.
But also don't
call her
no,
that.
But like, don't mess with it.
But I think sex ed policy and like recognizing why things are so bad in terms of the way that sex ed is or is not in America is because of politics and because of what we have and haven't allowed to go through with who we have in power. And those things take time, but they eventually become the norm. And that's what we kind of look to as culture, laws, policy, like all of those things impact the state of sex ed in the country.
Yeah, I think that's like beautiful framing. Like, people in our generation are always sort of surprised at like how people think about sex ed, but that is like not accidental. I mean, that is like a product culturally of America, and then we frequently will just politicize it and then institutionalize it. And it is so much freaking harder to make something, to undo something, than to make it happen in the first place. And Thomas Jefferson thought that we should rewrite our Constitution every generation.
Oh my God.
And when I first heard that, I was like, hell yeah. Like, what the heck are we doing?
Right.
That we're allowing sort of like these people who literally never thought I could even breathe in this country, step foot in this country, be a part of this country, dictate like what it is that it looks like. And laws often function the same way, that we'll institutionalize one law in a Congress and it'll have like a 10-year sunset. And you're always worried about, what's that like horrible like throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Oh,
we're
don't know.
This is a thing that others have said. But it's basically like, you don't want to throw away the tiny ounce of good that you've created. And so instead of like rewriting or undoing, you'll just sort of leave things be.
You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Which is like, what does that expression
I don't want
mean?
to know.
It's all right, so we'll just leave that be.
Let's just put it away.
Yeah. So I think from what I understand, like the conversation around sex ed from when it has happened in politics has basically been grounded on like whether it should be abstinence-based or comprehensive.
Right.
And like that has totally, like Democrats have been advocates of abstinence-based sex education. It sort of follows the cultural norms of America. And then all of that has now sort of, I think the like hot button sex ed, that conversation is obviously still happening and like varies by district, which is totally bonkers. But beyond that, now you have like a broader conversation about women's rights.
Right.
And I think that's taken a bunch of forms like equal pay, conversations about abortion. And that's like the current discourse. And I think in the Democratic Party, because I think in general, Democrats have moved away from any inkling of abstinence-based sex education.
For sure. Because it doesn't fucking work. There is so much research out there. Abstinence-only education does not work. There have been multiple studies, many papers, much research has been done on this. And comprehensive sex ed gives people the tools, makes people, you all know this if you're already listening, so I don't really have to rant about this, but I'm a little drunk, so just let me do it. Just don't scream at me. But, you know, you just need comprehensive sex ed in order to give people the shit that they need to live a good life. Like, it's proven.
And if you, just going back to our earlier conversation about the system, it's like, say you're a politician who is from a swing state, even if you firmly believe in comprehensive sex education, the problem is that when you decide to run for president or if you want to keep your seat, you have to like toe this line between keeping your seat and talking about things exactly the way that you want them to believe them to be.
You can't be fully honest.
Yeah, it's a hard line. And I think what people look for in the primary is somebody who can be honest and stick with their values, but also is capable of winning.
Right.
Which is like gross.
It's hard.
And it's, if you think about those swing states, I mean, like, you know, here on the coast, we're like, I wish somebody told me exactly how a penis entered a vagina from birth.
Right.
But in the middle of the country, there are places that are like, bringing that conversation into the space is like, eee.
Right.
So it's a hard balance.
It is. And we have this article that we are kind of wanting to maybe go through and check in about, because CNBC came out with this article a little bit ago. Let me load it. Safeena, are you having a good time?
I'm having the best time.
This is such a good interview. I just love it.
Wow, I love the instant feedback that's happening right now.
No, it's really working
and
for me.
I do want to say that Danielle and I always talk at this level of intellect.
Sure.
Yeah, we're just always here.
It's not true.
Friendship conversation.
It's not true.
I'm kind of sweating on your couch.
I know, I'm really sorry.
No,
the air
it's okay.
has to be off because of the sound. Oh,
yeah.
Do we want to take
Should we do that?
Sure, let's take a
load
break.
The article.
Yes,
We'll
and then
refill, and you'll refill your wine too, listener.
Yes. Take your sweet ass time.
Wow, you sent me a beautiful photo of myself.
Well, you actually sent that to yourself.
You're crazy, Danielle. Okay, great.
Okay, Safoonas, we're back.
We're back.
Welcome back.
Did everyone refill their wine?
Did everyone
Listener?
Listener, you're up there, we hope. There's like 2 people who listen.
Hi, back.
And my mom. I was just going to say my mom. Okay, so we found this article.
By Courtney
Conley, okay? At Classically Courtney.
Classically Court.
At Classically Court, if you want to follow this person on social medias. So the name of this article is Abortion, Equal Pay, Family Leave, : Here are all the women's rights policies proposed by 2020 candidates so far. This was written about a month-ish ago. So if there are new policies, you shoot us an email and you tell us.
Send them our way.
We'll post about it.
And we'll be happy to sort of react.
Yeah, with emojis or otherwise. So we're going to go through this because to kind of finish out this segment, we want to talk about like why certain political candidates are like worth looking into if you're interested in voting for people who care about sex ed. So the first thing here on the list, they kind of have this in like, you know, segments: abortion, equal pay, buckets, you know, Charlie Buckets from Willy Wonka.
Interesting. Is that his last name?
I think so.
Wow.
Anyway, so the first segment is abortion and reproductive rights. And the first person on here is Warren.
Yeah, I guess some background is that in May, Alabama passed this like extremely restrictive abortion law, which is illegal.
Right.
Like under our current abortion framework in the United States, federally, abortions are allowed within a certain period of a fetus's life and in a mother's gestation point. But these states, in a way, in protest and testing federalism,
Right.
Are basically passing these laws which would contradict our federal policy on abortion, making it more restrictive in their states to get an abortion. And they're like insanely restrictive.
Right.
And the Supreme Court in the past has said that like this kind of restriction on abortion shouldn't be allowed. So the article frames the candidate's response in a part to this kind of new development that we're seeing where states are taking it upon themselves to challenge the federal government's policy on abortion.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that background.
Hey, I've done 1 year of law school.
Hey, you're a lawyer.
You know what? I'm not a lawyer, I have to say that.
Yeah. She's legally obligated. No, she's not a lawyer, so don't ask her to do shit for you.
But in a different way, in like 2 years, give your girl a call.
Give your girl a call. 1-800-SAFUNAS. Okay, so Warren, of course, says that as president, if she is elected, that she would pass new federal laws to uphold the Roe v. Wade ruling and ensure all women have access to birth control and abortion, which is pretty cool for her to like make that stance.
Totally.
Wouldn't you say?
I agree. I mean, it's like, it's a different world where all these frickin' women are just like, I'm allowed to say these words and run for president.
Right.
And it's like, yeah.
Pretty fucking cool.
Yeah.
And she also talks about repealing the Hyde Amendment.
Yeah.
Which we should talk about.
We should talk about it.
Because the Hyde Amendment, you're the soon-to-be lawyer here, but my understanding of the Hyde Amendment is that it blocks abortion coverage essentially from low-income people of color, because they aren't allowed to use Medicaid to obtain an abortion.
Exactly. Federal funds are essentially restricted for abortions in almost every case, except for when like the mother's life is in jeopardy, and it's like that procedure is basically not even about the abortion anymore. And by restricting federal funds, like plot twist, our healthcare system requires that the federal government funds healthcare plans for low-income folks. So, and I think what's just like so important about this is like these democratic debates are about like poverty and climate change and the criminal justice system, and like each and every one of those things is impacted by like pregnancy. And politics has like this long, gross history with sex. And like, it's just funny that we don't connect sex to all of these things that we're talking about.
Totally.
And it's, you know, like the Hyde Amendment and restricting abortions, like white women and wealthy women, period, in this country have always been able to get abortions.
No problem.
And will always be able to get abortions.
Yep.
Because that's the way that it works. And so by restricting that same service to people who are low income, when at these debates and when we're talking about people who are middle class or poor, is like, yeah, we should discuss the connection between your inability to make decisions about family planning because our funding limits or our restrictions on your healthcare coverage. So that's important.
1,000%.
Yeah.
Moving on to Cory Booker.
Great.
So Cory Booker on May 22nd said that he released a plan to create a White House Office for Reproductive Freedom.
How cool is that?
You want to talk about that? What does that say in here?
So here's what I'll say about creating a White House office for it is like, that is essentially how the executive branch exercises a lot of power is by like creating an office that is financed within the White House, who has like an ear to the president, who is like, here's what we should be doing.
Right.
And in the context of the United States, like that's hugely important.
Yeah.
Both for the freedom component and also like, I think this article talks about this, but like our maternal mortality rates are awful. And when we talk about like this, people on both sides of the aisle believe that this country is about freedom. And like, what is freedom without reproductive freedom?
Oh, Americans love tattooing freedom and American flags and bald eagles on their chests.
Maybe
and their
next time
forehead.
on the air we'll get a freedom tattoo of some kind.
You know, here's what I'll say is I'll never do that.
Okay, here's what I'll say. Maybe. So it sounds like from the article that not only would he create a White House office to do this work, but he would increase the budget for family planning, and that he would reverse a gag rule that's in place under the Trump administration, which bans doctors from telling women about legal abortions. You know, the thing about something like that kind of gag rule is it's like probably really unevenly applied.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, your mom is probably the best person to talk about this,
Yeah.
but like people will talk about it if they want to, and they'll be like, I'm gag ruled if they don't want to.
Right.
So removing a ban like that just allows more flexibility in places where it's scarier to talk about abortion.
Totally.
And
what else does Booker say?
oh, he talks a little bit about the guidelines for the teen pregnancy prevention program. And from what I understand, that has to do with whether they're abstinence-based or comprehensive-based sex education programs. So it sounds like Corey has big plans.
I think so. And this is what I've heard from people is that like there has been quite a lot that's been coming from him, which I think is really awesome.
And as you know, I'm hugely biased because my boyfriend and I met at a Cory Booker fundraiser.
That's right.
In 2013.
And he tweeted back at you.
Yeah. I tweeted at him because this is who I am as a person. Hey, like, so excited to be helping you out tonight. I'm 20, haha. And he was just like, thanks so much for your help. And I was like,
no, we're together now.
I was like, and you as well. Which
and
is
you,
not
sir.
a response.
Sure.
But yeah, I what is encouraging is like this field of candidates is really strong.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And Kamala is next on the list.
Yes.
And she kind of talks about a plan that she has that would require states and localities with a history of violating Roe v. Wade to obtain approval from her Department of Justice before any abortion law or practice can take effect. So that's basically she's like protecting funding for Planned Parenthood, and would nominate people who support abortions.
Yeah. And this is like
or abortion rights, sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is a move that legally she could do because when you have a history of violating some kind of right, the government has more latitude to create a solution like this where you would then be stopped from violating right by like a proactive thing. So like this happened in the civil rights movement where if a country or if a state or locality had a history of violating civil rights, it was easier to enforce some kind of civil rights program onto them.
Cool.
So I think it's a really interesting idea to bring that into the abortion context where if you have a history of violating Roe v. Wade, now the Justice Department can have a proactive or prophylactic approach to your actions by saying like anything you want to do that touches abortion, we can get involved in.
I love that.
Yeah, and it's like a hard test.
It's kind of like fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Exactly right. And like it's cool because like you can point to concrete laws that they've passed in the past and say like for that reason we need to get involved here now, as opposed to waiting for a violation of rights and then coming in, which is great.
There's also something about John Hickenlooper here, and I don't care about him, so I'm not going to read this.
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and skip.
We're just going to go ahead.
My favorite tweet of this election so far was like a photo of John Hickenlooper at a debate, and the tweet was just like, who, and I cannot stress this enough, is this? I was like, no, yeah,
I cannot.
That is fair.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
He's like just fine in the debates. I don't care about him
There's
though.
of course, a rumor that he's just going to go run for Senate in Colorado.
Interesting.
So I think he bought the domain name to like run for Senate a day or two
John
ago.
Hickenlooper.
Hickenlooper, I mean, we have to say is a good name.
It's
a strong
It'll
name.
never be president.
No, but in a different way. Hell yeah. Cool name.
Anyway, moving on. All right, equal pay. Okay, we already know this. If you don't, read a book. Women earn 80 cents for every dollar.
Any book.
Literally read the Bible.
If
No,
like
it doesn't say
McGonagall
that.
was paid the same as Flitwick, like I'll eat my own shoe.
Okay, you're pathetic. Just kidding. Okay, so here's the thing. Again, and of course, let's be clear, women of color earn a lot less than that. From like 50 cents to 65 cents on the dollar, it says in this article.
And there are like, statistics that break that out by like Native American women versus African American women versus Asian American women. And it's totally varied.
Absolutely. And Kamala Harris, what does Kamala Harris say here?
So she leads the way, according to CNBC. And it has a bunch of components. But it seems like the big pillars of equal pay across the board are like transparency.
Yes.
Because, of course, if people were aware of generally what the men and women in their organization made, they would have negotiating power.
Yep.
I've taken so many freaking like negotiation seminars.
Yeah.
Where they're like, the best thing you can do is come in with data. And it's like, and from where and from whom shall I get this magical data?
Truly.
That says how much my male coworker is making compared to me.
Right.
So transparency feels huge.
Totally.
She has like a certification program that companies could obtain. And we've seen this be really successful with like LEED building certification. Like people want to be certified that they're doing the right thing. And because all of us, listener, consumers are like demanding that companies act right. And the more we do that, the more they're like, oh, well, look at me. I just like Ben and Jerry's. I'm a B Corp. And you're like, what? So they're starting to like care about having consumers perceive that they're doing the right thing.
Right.
And let us be careful not to be duped because sometimes those certifications can be lobbied to look like how you want them to look. So
that's important.
So it sounds like that's a big part of her proposal.
Yeah. So, but she's interested in talking about it.
Yeah.
And then there's Sanders, who very briefly in this article, it says that he would adopt an Equal Pay Act through the Paycheck Fairness Act, which, was proposed when he was starting politics in 1963. And then there's Yang, of course.
Yeah, Yang's such an interesting character.
Universal basic income. Dylan Levy-Gant, my little sweet brother, if you're listening, he is obsessed with Andrew Yang.
And that feels right, Chico.
Really right on the money.
Here's what I'll say.
Okay, say it.
Yeah, it sort of makes sense.
That's it? That's all you have?
A couple things that I really like about Andrew Yang.
Sure.
And I'm not picking a candidate, listener.
No, let's be clear.
Let's be clear. But the one thing that I love is that to exist in this country and to have access to your basic rights, you need a minimum level of income.
You need money.
So why don't we just give it to you? Because the market is doing a horrible job of providing stability. So that's one. And two, the other thing I really like that Andrew Yang talks about is when we think about losing jobs as a middle class, we always frame it as like these immigrants are sneaking in the middle of the night,
stealing our
these
jobs.
And Andrew Yang's framing is sort of like, hey, machines exist.
It's robots.
Maybe it's them.
Plot twist.
Yeah, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think it points out that we like scapegoat a lot of people when in fact it tends to be companies that are like aggressively trying to figure out how to save money. So that's just interesting framing. And Andrew Yang, according to CNBC, wants to implement pay disclosure laws, which New York City has implemented. And disclosure and non-disclosure laws, I guess, work together. Either that an employer can't ask your prior salary history, which is what New York did, because in that way they're not repeating the sins of like a company in the past that might have paid you improperly.
Right.
Or in the alternative, here's what we pay everyone in our company in our C-suite. And the other thing, this is like a classic Yang, he wants to test the efficacy of those laws to see what works, which I love. So I say classic Yang in a pleasant way.
I think it's great. And then there's Buttigieg, also into the Paycheck Fairness Act, annual report, yada, yada, yada. There's additional measures. Warren and Booker haven't specifically released plans, but they're co-sponsors. So, like, all these people, the cool thing, like you said, about this, like, strong kind of set of candidates, there are too fucking many, but...
Agreed.
They really are, like, being proactive about things that we, as, like, two liberal, like, people really care about.
Totally. And I think, speaking of sort of action items for the group, is if something that we're talking about, you feel like there's like a gap, you know, like there's a huge women's or LGBT or sex issue that's important to you, that candidates aren't talking about, like, you can just write them. And like they have staff whose full-time job is to respond. And I interned in a Senate office.
Yes.
So
yes,
huge
you did.
expertise. And I remember we'd get letters that were kind of like, I had this issue today. What do you think, Senator? And like my job was to go find the legislative director who would talk to the senator or chief of staff. And we'd like oftentimes be forced to think about issues because people randomly asked.
Yeah.
And
that's the cool power of the power to the people kind of thing, right?
And like for all its ills, social media can allow you to do that. They accept a lot of feedback over email. If you have friends that work on the campaign, I love asking my friends who work on campaigns, like, what does your candidate think about this thing? And they will get an answer to you. So it's important. Like, I'm sure a lot of these plans we've been talking about came out of somebody being like, where the heck is your equal pay plan? And somebody putting one together. So
right. Totally.
That's power.
So the next issue on here is maternal mortality. Oh. So if you don't know, maternal mortality is like absolutely horrific in the United States, specifically for women of color and Black women even more specifically. And that, of course, is due to a combination of racism and not getting like Black women their needs met, and not listening to Black women, also not like giving proper diagnoses. There's so many things that we've talked about like in public health school where like we just simply aren't paying enough attention as like doctors, as white people, as people who have privilege and aren't experiencing those things that Black pregnant women are experiencing. So that's just like a little bit of background. And according to this article, the U.S. is one of 13 countries where maternal mortality has worsened in the last 25 years. We're like the worst out of like all developed countries with this issue. It's horrific.
And we're getting worse.
Yeah.
And it's horrible to just like take a beat and really think about the fact that a person who, and specifically a Black woman who is pregnant in this country, has to fear for her life as a result of that pregnancy, and put that person in a state like Alabama where their access to abortion is restricted. It's like a horrible, horrible combination of things.
Totally. And nationally, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes than white women, which is just really, again, horrible. We should not be accepting this. And I think it's interesting because some of these candidates aren't, right? So Elizabeth Warren is in the beginning of this article for this topic. She wants to incentivize health systems that keep moms healthy, push for more inclusive best practices that have benefited mothers of color, and diversify hospital staff, which I think is really awesome. Yeah. And I really like the next piece about Kamala Harris. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So Kamala Harris would reintroduce a bill, which obviously has a fancy abbreviation, as all bills do, which would provide a grant for training programs to fight racial bias in maternal health. And I think, Danielle, you bring a lot of experience to this in an MPH program, but when your caregivers are biased, it of course impacts the quality of care that you get.
Right.
And if you think about one of the root causes of maternal mortality, it would, of course, be discrimination or bias or inability to understand what people are bringing in the door with them. And I know that a lot of healthcare systems are looking at sort of community-focused healthcare in which you're sort of understanding the population that you serve as more than the health issue that they bring in with them. And I think that that's really interesting because it shows a nuanced understanding beyond just we're not giving adequate drugs.
Right.
That's about what people bring into the hospital with them.
Yeah, and it's current, right?
Yeah.
Like there's research that shows that like racial bias does impact health outcomes, and this bill like speaks to that.
Totally.
Which I think is so important. And it's not pennies, like $25 million grant for training programs. The bill would also include $125 million to identify high-risk pregnancies, provide mothers with culturally competent health care and resources. Like this is like what we are fighting for in public health. And I think like reading this gained like a lot more respect for Kamala Harris.
And I think it's important to add sort of another intersectionality to the conversation, which you always hear that folks with like non-archetypal bodies get like pushed out of the healthcare system. I've been to so many doctors where their response was like, lose 15 pounds and maybe you'll be fine.
Same.
And it's like, most of the time it's a serious medical issue that cannot be resolved from weight loss or weight gain or whatever it is. So I think in general, the like sort of cultural competence for the medical community is really important.
Huge. Yeah. And let this be a good time to talk about the fact that people in medical school do not, barely, even if they do, receive sex education, and they don't receive like queer or LGBTQ kind of like sex education or issues or ways in which to talk about those things with their patients. And that needs to change immediately. Like that should be like, we need an overhaul, a sweep in the medical system in terms of in medical schools. The curriculum needs to match the current needs of people today.
Of course.
And why doesn't it,
I've been to a doctor in New York, and I picked this doctor because on her website, it specifically said like queer friendly. And it's like kind of astounding that you have to market as a niche medical provider.
Right.
That should just be
and this is in New York City.
It's in New York City. And it's like basic medical competence should include, I serve everyone who needs medical care.
Totally.
And it doesn't require a special note on my website or on my door, which
absolutely
I found really welcoming, but of course is like, okay, so everyone else isn't?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have last thing about maternal mortality. So Booker hasn't released a detailed plan for this, but in May, he and Rep from Massachusetts, Ayanna Pressley, introduced the Mommies Act. Very cute. Very cute. Maximizing outcomes for moms through Medicaid improvement and enhancement of services. So it would extend the time in which Medicaid will cover postpartum women from 2 months after giving birth to 1 year. Really important stuff, because there's so much stuff on like postpartum depression that like no one talks about. I've heard so many stories kind of recently about people giving birth and just how much pain they had to endure, even when they got like epidurals and like other things. And even, if they didn't, but like their stitches are still in there, or they're having trouble with their like bladder, or, they're having depression issues. Like there's so many things that can like happen after you give birth, and extending that is so necessary.
I think anytime your body goes through anything, the importance of having like accessible people to talk to about what you're experiencing, both physically and emotionally, is crucial. And like, I feel like probably many of us have experienced like an illness of some kind, or like breaking a bone, and it's traumatic. Yeah. And like, as a society, we've actually gotten good about talking about mental trauma, and like are sort of aware that you need coaching out of mental trauma, but like physical trauma, and probably one of the most physically traumatic events of a person's life, obviously requires access to strong wraparound services in the year in which you're recovering from that. I remember I broke my foot, as
walking on the sidewalk
a couple months ago, and a person's advice was like to seek out one of these medical providers that if you pay like, you know, X number of dollars, you're in the system, and then you can reach out to them whenever you want. They have doctors on text, on Skype, whenever. And it's like, I don't really want to have to pay more to have accessible healthcare providers.
You shouldn't have to, also.
Of course, because it's like, this is the game. Like, this is
right.
This is what
Back
it's all
to
about.
Game Night with Jason Bateman.
And Jumanji starting to rock, and Jack Black themselves. The Rock.
Oh, I could have sworn you said LeBron.
Okay, that would have been an interesting version of Jumanji that, again,
it would have been bad.
Watched.
Anyway.
All
right, last thing on this article. Also, thank you again to, what's the name? Courtney Conley.
Yeah, she's guiding us.
For really providing us with all of this content. So the last thing in this article, is about paid family leave. So we're, in the U.S., if you didn't know this, the only industrialized country that does not mandate employers to provide paid family leave.
Great.
What the fuck?
What a town.
It's so bad. So Kristen Gillibrand, who I feel like gained a lot of momentum kind of in the beginning and then maybe has like quieted down a little bit.
I will say I've met her a couple times.
You have?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And in New York State, and in general, she is so good on women's stuff.
Okay.
She was like one of the early people talking about the Me Too movement. She is just like accessible to women. I think I met her at like a conference for minority and women-owned businesses the first time, and she was like around and like was open to chat with anybody. She is really good.
That's
on
awesome.
women's stuff. And I think you're right, has not been getting a ton of attention.
As much press.
Yeah.
But
even though she wore that cool pink dress at the last debate, and I was like,
wow.
I'm so happy to be alive at a time where like a great pink dress is being worn at a presidential debate.
Pretty cool.
Really cool.
Yeah.
And then I think somebody pointed out that like Carly Fiorina at one point also wore pink, but like matters less to me personally.
Sure, that's fine.
So we love you, Gillibrand.
We love you, Gillibrand.
And also your amazing record on women.
Stances. That's right. And here, 12 weeks is what Kristen Gillibrand would give of paid family leave and medical leave to any employee who needs their care for a new child, a sick family member, or their own health issues.
Which is just like the framing of that. If I ever get sick, I'm always like, what the heck am I going to do? But the idea that you could take this leave for your own health issues even.
Right.
Which I hope that would be like a broad, all-encompassing kind of self-assessment of that.
And for it to be paid.
And then, you know, we were talking earlier about how politics influences culture. If that's just part of our society that people take this leave when they need it, it'll just change completely the way we talk about leave in general.
Absolutely. And then there's the Family Act, right? She's introduced in every Congress since 2013, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
All companies, no matter the size, with access to paid family leave, paid for by having employees and employers contribute no more than $2 per week for a typical worker fund. Employees would earn 66% of their monthly wages, capped at $4,000 per month per person.
Pretty sweet, livable amount.
I would say so.
Depends on where you are in the world, but
right, absolutely, and how many kids you have or your family, what that looks like. But yeah, that's it. That's super important.
And that bill, it looks like, is supported by Warren, Booker, Sanders, Harris, and Klobuchar. So that's the group is getting behind that. And I think sort of like in general, what you'll find is that if anybody has a good idea right now in the primary, it will get a lot of support from the other candidates, which is a great thing about the primary.
Oh, for sure.
Like you can kind of be like, well, this person said this. Do you also say that? And they're like,
sure I do.
Yes, me as well too. I also would
much
want
good.
That.
That's so funny.
And then, you have to be careful because people walk a lot of that back during the general.
Right.
But now is a good time to hold people to account for their promises.
Right. And to kind of end this whole thing, right? So Yang on his campaign website says that as president, he would fight for a policy that requires employers to offer at least 9 months of paid family leave that's distributed between parents however they see fit. So, if it's a double parent household taking care of a kid, maybe they could split that time up. Or 6 months of paid leave for a single parent. Personally, 12 weeks, great. Give me 6 months to a year. I think other countries have, and of course you can make the argument, other countries are not as big as America. Other countries have different socioeconomic kind of levels. There are different race, what's the word I'm looking for? Makeups of the country, For example, Sweden, probably mostly white Swedish people, I would say. In America, doesn't look like that.
Right.
So I think that you can make the argument that America isn't quote unquote fit to be compared to other countries. And at the same time, like this article and many other articles have said, is we are the only industrialized first world, quote unquote, country that does not have mandatory paid family leave.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant and important thing to touch on, because what we do as this country is we decide that our Americanness is in part our economic prosperity. And some might argue, we sacrifice paid family leave because we're just so wealthy and good.
Right.
And the cost of that is most people, because this is sort of the Robert Reich income inequality argument, which is that America, on balance, might be doing great, but it's the small group of people who likely could take any amount of family leave that they want, who are likely getting paid at the rate that they want, who have access to abortion and healthcare as they want. And they're reaping the benefits of our sacrifice for America's quote unquote prosperity. And I think what you're hearing in the Democratic debates, and obviously this is my bias, but I think in the Democratic Party is without creating an alternative rubric on which we judge ourselves, our America is going to be a bad place for many Americans. So while economic prosperity or GDP is one way to judge how successful a country is, how happy or how healthy our moms are, or how happy or healthy our low income folks are, or how happy or healthy our average middle class folks are, we could make that our metric for success. It's I feel this way in my normal life all the time. My measure of success could be how much money I make or how happy I am.
Right.
And you can totally pick. And when you're a country, you have to find a way for happiness to be attainable in the economic scheme. And if those two things are totally disparate the way that they are today, you're not going to get the kind of America that we want to see. And I think that that's the political fight that we're fighting is not Trump. It's not one freaking person.
Right.
Although one freaking person is a great thing to focus your energy on.
Right.
In this community and in this culture. But it's about what is important. And to Thomas Jefferson's point about creating a new constitution every generation, I think our generation more than others in the past has decided there are other things that we care about. And we talk about mental health and sex and our prosperity outside of our economic health. And how do you encourage your candidate and your political world to reflect those values? And that's what we're fighting for, is a system that cares about us the way we're starting to care about us.
That's it.
So we're drunk, I guess.
I think. But thank you so much for being on this podcast.
So happy
you
to do
have
it.
brought so much love and intellect and brilliance into this season and episode and beyond. And if there's one thing that we can kind of like recommend our listeners to do, it's like to like go and engage yourself in the political system and like go out and vote and like do your research, have conversations with your family and friends, and know that you do matter in the system.
Exactly. Thanks, Danielle.
That's it. Our creator, producer, and host is me, Danielle Bezalel, aka DB. Our assistant producer is Kathy Cohen. Our graphic illustrator is Alanna Rance. Our sound engineer is Oliver Divone. Our fundraising co-coordinator is Jamie Cooper. And our other fundraising co-coordinator / content assistant is Callie Cochran. Our music is by Ben Sound and Hook Sounds. Thank you so much to our featured voices, sponsors, and our listeners. Tune in next time.